All right, welcome everybody to another edition of Ham Radio Perspectives, where we talk about history, culture, and technology of ham radio. All three of those today, in fact, in one terrific topic. My name's Quinn, and my call letters are K8QS.
And my name is Tom. Tango Oscar Mike, Whiskey Alpha 9 Tango Delta Delta.
TDD, the Tasmanian Daredevil, we used to call
Right.
you. Yeah, so we both grew up in Chicago, and we'll have some stories about that and all. We go back in the 1960s with the hobby. And so we've got this phenomenal topic for you all today to think about and comment down below about. It is a zinger. It's a doozy to talk about the doozy car again, the way they used to come up with that. And so we're going to see what you all think about this. And here's the topic. Give it thought. Give us a hearing here before you tune out and think we're totally out of our mind here, because we really do want to have some fun with this topic. 10 reasons we miss frequency drift. We miss it. You know, we're back in the area when frequency drift was a whole part of the culture and the technology, and it became part of the history of ham radio. And now that I've got an IC 7300 like that one pictured right there. I don't get much at all in the way of frequency drift.
And what kind of fun is that?
Yeah, what kind of fun is that, man? Part of the whole hobby, the history of the hobby. You could write a history of ham radio just looking at frequency drift. Tom, tell us what in the world is frequency drift?
Okay, frequency drift is the that whistling sound you get when you start on frequency, and like a Doppler shift. It's either moving up or down depending on the lack of stability in your transmitter. Ever since the arrival of phase lock loop, or PLL, you don't hear it anymore. But on these some of these boomer type radios that we used to operate, it was a frequent and daily occurrence.
Yeah, it was part of the fun. And so we're talking about frequency drift, moving up and down the band, so to speak. And it could happen with your receiver, and it could happen with your transmitter.
And it happened with both.
Yeah, it could happen with both.
Yeah, you had a difficult time maintaining.
Yeah, and if you didn't have a transceiver, but you had a separate receiver and transmitter, you could be all over the place.
QSO.
Yeah, you dropped out for a second there, time, which is typical. By the way, what happened at $3 billion that the administration put into rural Wi-Fi? Did you get any of that?
No, not a penny of it.
No,
I'm still on dial-up.
Yeah, we're making a joke of it, but it's absolutely true. If Tom drops out or looks terrible, it doesn't have to do with his technology. It has to do with the fact that the Rural Broadband Initiative has not come in. So he's got some let's call it video drift.
There we go.
You're going to drift in and out here. Okay, so here we go, gang.
Okay. All right. Well, go ahead, Quinn.
Well, it's a vintage problem. I don't you know that we talk about vintage radio and nobody says drift is a vintage problem.
That's probably the most likely rigs to drift or anything built in the early to mid 60s. We've got up in the upper right hand corner the drift king of radio is the Heathkit VF1. It was their first attempt at making a VFO. I personally had one and can testify to its instability. Next to that on the right is the Lafayette. Looks like a clone of one of the Hallicrafters HA20 VFOs. And below that, the beloved Knight T150 transmitter that had all the qualities of the two above.
In fact, we put that rig, that Knight kit, in our video that thousands of people have seen and given us great kudos for, about the worst HF rigs of all time, because you sold me one of those turkeys. And the only way I could make a contact with that T150 was if I were using a crystal, which was the old way that we would lock the frequency, and you put a crystal in there, and that would work. As soon as I'd go on the VFO, I didn't know where I was, and nobody knew where I was. What a piece of...
And every time you went key down with the thing, the rectifier tubes would arc.
And it would move. the frequency would jump. It just didn't drift. It hopped like a bunny.
Right.
And what's that thing in the bottom right, Tom?
That is an ICO VFO, another piece of questionable manufacture. And we'll get into that in a little bit.
Yeah, now just so you all know, we're making fun of these things, but there are a lot of people out there who figured out how to improve them, and to change the condensers and add various things, including deal with the heating problem, because often heat was an issue and the like. So we're making fun of these things, but we don't want to make fun of people who collect them or who have improved upon them over the years, except for the VF1 VFO, which I've seen some great things online. People have improved those, but we're going to talk about that because you had one of those suckers, and man, you were all over the band with that. So, okay, here we go. Believe it or not, this was my beloved Swan. So I'm in high school, and I save up enough loot from about 3 part-time jobs, cutting lawn, delivering papers, all kinds of stuff. And I con my older brother into driving me from Chicago up to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Amateur Electronics Supply. I had just enough money, not including tax, because if you drove up there, they would illegally mark it as having been shipped. So you didn't have to pay taxes. I don't know if you remember that, Tom, but at any rate, so I pick up my Swan 500C. Oh, was I going to, I was so happy, Tom. 500 watts with these sweep tubes, the TV sweep tubes, you burn those suckers out so fast. And so I had this thing, dragged it down to Chicago, put it on my lousy dipole antenna that didn't have a balun or anything, and got on the air and started tuning around. And I noticed a very weird thing. I would tune a signal in, and then I would start to take some notes. This is mostly CW, write down calls or whatever. And I noticed the people that were sending were moving. They were moving up or down the band. I said, what the heck is going on? So I'd track them down a little bit, and then I'd have to move it some more. And we would get into what used to be called leapfrogging. Do you remember that term, Tom?
Yep, I do indeed.
Yeah, so leapfrogging was where you're going back and forth with the frequency, because the two people who are communicating are adjusting their frequencies back and forth. And so you're leapfrogging. The Swan 500C on CW in particular, for me, was a great leapfrog. In fact, I thought they should call it the Leapfrog 500C. But that was my beloved Swan. I actually wish I had one of those again just for fun. It would be great. So let's get into the serious part of this non-serious presentation. Hang in there, Tom. Hang in there.
I need another beer.
So 10 reasons why we miss. What are we missing here? Drift. Go for it.
Number 1, we miss the fun of social pecking orders defined according to level of operator's frequency drift. And to this one, Quinn, I can claim the number 1 top spot, the king of drift. We used to have a net. It was called the Drip Net. I think that because Lou misunderstood our Drift Net name. But I had the beloved VF1 VFO on a Heathkit DX40 when I started out, and everybody was telling me to move up as I was drifting down. So as a consequence, I kept most of my comments short so that I could adjust frequency to get back on frequency.
Oh, I love that.
We had number 2 in the pecking order.
Number 2, yeah, we'll get to number 2 in just a second. But about you being number 1 with that VF1, you probably know this, but when you would do a long transmission, and this was on 10 meter AM every night at 9 p.m., you would start moving off, and you would be gone. So we would start talking and saying, would somebody check where Thomas just disappeared to? It was great. We would just keep on talking, and then at some point you would listen and realize that you weren't part of the QSO anymore.
Yeah, I had to use the spot function to get back on frequency. Number 2 in the pecking order. I won't use his full call, but the suffix of his call was T and we all nicknamed him the Whistling Elevator. You remember, Ben?
Oh, do I? Yeah, yeah. I can't remember what rig he had that was so bad, but he was such a nice guy, and he had such a nice voice. His problem was he didn't know when to shut up and check his frequency. So he would just keep talking and talking and talking, and on he would go. And so pecking orders here, we would make fun of one another according to how much you drifted. And if somebody had, like, occasionally somebody would break into our net who had a Collins S line that was doggone stable for the time. And, they'd be right there the whole time. And we knew right away that they lived in another world than what any of us lived in. They had it made. And so we all felt inferior. All right, let's.
Well, no, and SRZ, he had all government equipment that he had purloined from the Mars program. He was probably the most stable guy on our net.
Yeah. Okay, so he did pretty well. So let's go to number 2 here. We missed the ongoing conversations about what causes frequency drift, how to reduce it, and which rigs have less or more of it. This was a whole huge topic in the hobby. And if you were not a conversationalist, you were a typical ham radio operator, particularly on sideband now, where you didn't know how to have a conversation with somebody, you could always bring up the topic of drift as you were drifting around and they were drifting around, and what are you doing about it, and how do you reduce it? And everybody would talk about which rigs had more or less of it. And there were certain whole manufacturers that people talked about the drift. ICO, you showed their VFO, but ICO was one of those. Boy, they made some real drift masters, but I can't remember which rig was called the Drift Master. So if any of you watching this can remember that, post a note down below which rigs were called. There was one in particular, specific rig, not just a brand, that was called the Drift Master. All right,
I think the ICO wasn't that called the 7 Drifty?
The 7 Drifty. There you. Oh, yeah. Wow. The 753, the 7 Drifty 3. Oh, yeah, that's good, Tom. Good memory. Oh, this is great stuff. Okay, number 3, go for it.
Okay, we missed the fun of confabbing with OCD operators. I guess they would call them Karens today, whose radio lives around identifying and supposedly eliminating frequency drift. The one-trick ops.
Yeah, the one-trick ops who obsessive compulsive disorder about drift. That's all they talked about. That's all they thought about. They're so worried. People can get worried about one thing or another in life, and people can get worried about one thing or another in ham radio. And boy, there were people out there that drift. In fact, if they heard you drifting, let's say on sideband, they would break in and tell you that you were drifting. They were the watchdogs. We'll talk about the watchdogs more in just a minute, but it was another whole part of this hobby.
The funny part was when you thought you were on frequency, you were having a lengthy conversation, and a guy comes back on you and is telling you this frequency is occupied, old man. I found out you drifted into another QSO altogether.
Oh yeah. We'll get into that. Number 4.
We missed the special QSL cards known as official observer reports. And these were, I believe they were pink, and they came in the mail. And I think I still have some amongst my old QSLs.
The ones I got, Tom, well, we should explain. An official observer was somebody who, I think they were approved by the ARRL, the American Radio Relay League. And they were known to know the rules, and they didn't drift a lot themselves, and they could identify drift, and they would write these cards. For me, it was these postcards that I would get.
Right.
And the postcard would tell me, I heard you in such and such a day and time and so forth. And sometimes they would send you one that was saying that you were a good operator, a good op. You used all of the correct procedures and this and that, whether you were on CW or AM or SSB, whatever. But usually if you got an OO report, it was because you had a problem of some kind. And drift was one of those, especially if you were drifting across the band, interfering with other stations. And then, worst of all, you were near the edge of the band and you drifted completely outside the band. And I got one of those, Tom, from an old guy in Chicago who heard me operating CW looking for DX on the bottom of 20 meters. And I was very close to the edge of the band, and doggone if I didn't drift right out of the band. I can't remember what rig I had at the time. I think it was a Heathkit HX20 transmitter, single 6146, but it might have been a different one. And but here's the good part of a 00 report, Tom. You know, I could go weeks that I couldn't work anybody. I mean, my antenna was so bad, my transmitter was so bad, or I had that T150 piece of junk from you, and I couldn't get my transmitter and receiver on the same frequency. It was horrible. But suddenly I would get an whole report, and I said, praise the Lord, I'm getting out. Somebody heard me somewhere. Even if I was out of the band, they heard me. You'd also get them for key clicks and buzzes and all that.
And chirps.
Yeah, and chirps.
Chirps and chirps. Yeah.
I got to tell you, Tom, interesting thing. In putting this presentation, the slides together, I went online and looked through Google for images of 00 reports. And I found a bunch of them, and all of them were for being a good operator. Nobody posted an 00 postcard with the snide comments. One time I got one from an 00 guy who was listening to our 10-meter net at night. I gave the mic to my brother who was there, 9 years older, and he grabbed the mic and he started talking. He started using swear words. Oh, it was bad. And everybody was laughing on the frequency. Wouldn't you know, an 00 was listening and sent me a card saying that an unlicensed person was using improper language on my transmitter.
Amazing.
All right, number 5.
We missed the articles, presentations, and discussions about the topic, most of which no one paid attention to except in theory.
Yeah, in theory, right? I mean, in theory, we all wanted to have minimum drift, but practically getting rid of it was a huge problem.
Unless you could get a Collins S line or something equivalent to that, you were pretty much beleaguered by it.
Yeah, you were consigned to the lower end, more or less, of the pecking order, and that was that. So I do recall, though, that I bought an external fan that I could put in the back of one of my transmitters and blow air through there, figuring if I could keep the temperature constant, then I would have less drift. Didn't work.
No, you're at the FM station I worked at. We had crystal ovens. You remember those crystal ovens?
Oh, wow. Hey, remind people. A lot of people probably don't even know what they are.
Yeah, crystal oven. Even crystals on a given frequency would drift due to thermal expansion. And we'd have a little box that was probably about the size of a couple cigarette pack sizes that had a little heater in it. And it would maintain a constant temperature with the crystal in it to hold the thing on frequency. So VFOs weren't the only nemesis of drift that actually operated on crystals, but these were for FM and AM broadcast stations where you were tightly limited on the amount of drift, or it was drift. There's no other word for it off of the assigned frequency.
Yeah, the instability of the circuit that produces the frequency. Of course, all circuits have frequencies, but that's a good memory, Tom. I had forgotten about that. There are probably some old radio stations somewhere, in the mountains of North Carolina, whatever, that are still using those. You never know. All right, number 6, we miss the unexpected QSOs that would suddenly emerge as we unintentionally wandered up and down the band, even during other QSOs. Now, to explain this to somebody today who's newer in the hobby, they would never understand this, but it could get to the point where you started drifting and all of a sudden you were in a QSO, particularly on CW, this happened, with somebody else right in the middle. So maybe they lost their partner who was in QSO with them, and you think this is the person that you were communicating with. And so, right, did it back and forth, received, and suddenly you realize this is not the person that you were in QSO with. Somebody else suddenly appeared. And I had this happen on sideband when I was using for my receiver a Hallicrafters, what was that, an SX111. I had an SX111, and I had a number of different transmitters in there, but whatever the transmitter receiver combination I had at one time was, on sideband, even on my beloved band of 40 meters, I would suddenly end up, you mentioned QRMing or interfering with somebody else nearby, but you'd actually end up in another QSO.
Well, you had the sideband as what, 3 kilohertz signal?
Yeah, at most.
And 3 kilohertz drift on one of those old VFOs was nothing.
Yeah, was nothing. We haven't mentioned this, but often with the older rigs too, we would let them warm up.
Right.
You could minimize some of it because, man, with that Swan 500C, within the first 15 minutes of me turning that thing on, the drift was horrific. I could not do any stable QSO whatsoever with that thing.
The thermal stability. I remember to have to turn the rig on about a half hour before a QSO, before I got on the air, to let the thing stabilize. And not only was heat a cause for drifts, but you always had mechanical instability. You let the rig warm up, the coils would expand off of their original manufacturer. The capacitors and resistors would change their original tolerances. And that's why when we talked about what caused drift and how do we fix it, there's a couple slides back, you didn't know where to start. Was it a bad coil? Was it a bad crystal? Was it a bad oscillator? Was it a bad resistor? You could go through the whole rig and replace everything and probably not find the exact problem. Of course, components with a 10% tolerance and variation of manufacturer didn't help things either.
Yeah, with the T100, that night kit, if I touched it on the side, it would change my frequency. There was some kind of capacitance thing going on, right. Probably because I had a lousy ground and all too. But man, that was a deal. And then if I really banged into it, I was gone. I was 5 kilohertz down the band. Number 7.
We miss the ability to stay awake when listening to boring SSB QSOs. I remember one incident of this, and I won't remember. He's still alive, I believe, so I won't mention his call sign, but falling asleep at the switch in the middle of a round table, and then coming back after the round table adjourned and coming back an hour later and still hearing him snoring into his Vox. Yeah, that was something. That was something to behold. You had to be there.
Yeah, one guy that I know that happened to a number of times was he was running a Hallicrafters HT37 transmitter. I think he had the matching receiver, the SX1. What the heck was it? I can't remember. But at any rate, he was notorious for that. And so imagine now you're listening to somebody, whether it's on CW or sideband, and there's drift involved. You have to be attentive, and you have to keep retuning. So it's not like with the IC7300 that I showed at the beginning. You just turn that thing on like I do in my home office shack here, and I can listen. I could listen all day and not have to get up and not really pay attention. You had to pay attention as to what was going on, or you were gone. Number 8, we miss discussions. Note the quote around discussions about what frequency we are really, truly, unequivocally, even supposedly verifiably on. So hams would you could spend 5 minutes arguing about what frequency you were on. Oh boy.
Because everybody was drifting up or down.
Yeah. And in Chicago, again, although this is probably going on around the country, there was some type of station that would come on, and they would announce this in advance. I think it was through the ARRL that they were going to have a frequency test contest. And then you would tune in that frequency and you would send by mail, because there was no email or whatever, by mail, you would send in the frequency that you thought this guy's transmitter, which was presumably super duper stable, was actually on. And I remember one time with my SX111, I thought, okay, I'm going to enter this contest. It was so funny to me that this was happening, because I had nothing to measure. If you look at an old SX111, I should have put one up there. It's just like every 5 kilohertz, it's got a line to indicate that you are within 5 kilohertz. Right. So I would tune in this guy, and then I would make a super guesstimate for fun, because you had to send it in like he was on 7.25106. And I would send this thing in, and then I'd get a report back that he would send as to what it really was. It was just kind of a funny thing. But the discussions about all of this, what frequency are you on? What are we really on? And a funny thing, Tom, now is what I realize with all these stable digital rigs is, even when I hear people calling CQ, they will put themselves exactly on a frequency.
Right.
Nobody will just tune to listen in where there's no interference, right, between stations. That kind of thing hardly happens anymore. Everybody wants to get on the exact frequency, not because they have a net there, not because they get on that frequency all the time, but just because there's something psychologically going on that if it shows on your rig that you're on an exact frequency, then you are a more righteous operator. Number 9.
We miss reading about frequency, stability, drift, and official manufacturer rig specs. Not that it was thoroughly trustworthy for real life operation.
Yeah. Remember?
Yeah. Who was that big outfit that always did a review of all the technical specs of radios, and can't remember the name offhand.
Yeah, there's the guy out in, I think he's in Nebraska. Can't remember his name either. Iowa. Yeah. He still does all of the spec stuff. Oh man, right. I'm blanking on his name. Apologizing to you. He does such a great job, and he can really get into it. He's got all the equipment and all. But even many decades ago, the manufacturers would use whatever equipment they had to try to measure the stability, and when they would put that into their specs, and often they would put it, let's say, in an ad in a ham radio magazine, or this is before the internet online. And you'd look at that and you would assume that meant something, so that you could compare rigs in terms of stability.
And it meant that they just wrote down the engineering specs that they originally had planned for the radio, and didn't allow for thermal, shock, or power supply variations.
Oh, yeah. That's another one. Variation in voltage. So real life operation would be different from what the specs were always. But I suppose the specs were a beginning point. But in those days of drift, the specs meant something. Okay, number 10, we miss more easily identifying CW, DX on the fly, along with chirps and buzzes. Now, this is going to, again, require some explanation, and newer hams are going to think we're lying about this. But those of you who are older hams, put a note down below, will you? Say, these guys are not out of their mind. I used to work a lot of lower band DX on CW because my antenna was so lousy, my transmitters were so lousy, my receivers were so lousy. I could do CW and work DX. And often I could tell if it was a DX station, even if they weren't giving their ID. I just ran across them all of a sudden, because particularly in areas that now called the developing world, they would be using cheaper equipment and their power systems were not that stable. And you could say, hey, that's DX because it sounds like DX. They're drifting,
Right.
or they got a chirp, brah, 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 or they got a buzz. I used to, Tom, hear buzzy CW from stations in Cuba. I got to the point where I thought I could identify a station operating in Cuba because there was such lousy filtering,
Right.
that all of the signals were buzzing. Now, that was a stereotype. It wasn't true of all Cuban operators, of course. But this is true. You could more easily identify certain kinds of DX by their instability.
Number
So
11.
Yeah. What is the equivalent today? In other words, is there something that hams talk about and it creates a pecking order and all of the things we've talked about, all 10 items? Is there something that is the equivalent of this today? And I'm not sure there is, Tom. We lived at a time when there was a topic that in all 10 dimensions of this, it really worked and became a phenomenal phenomenon at the time. Can you think of anything equivalent today?
The only thing I could think of equivalent today are the small, you buy them for $10 on eBay or whatever, $10 Japanese or Chinese manufactured little radios that you can fit in a pillbox. I mean, they have no structural integrity. They have no filtering. They have no power supply that doesn't vary all over the place. Even when you run it on a 9-volt battery, as the battery wears down, then it's not so much drifting, but you're getting chirping. But no, ever since phase lock loop, you're pretty much locked in on frequency. The only thing I've heard is sometimes on the bands when I'm listening to another QSO, I got to use my RIT because somebody's off the frequency just a little bit, make them almost unintelligible, but they're always there. They're right there on frequency, always off the same amount. So I can't think of anything equivalent today.
Yeah. So if anybody out there has an idea of an equivalent, some topic that fits within the 10 dimensions that we've talked about, let us know. Put a note down below. We might even do a video on that topic or any other topics of interest. We're grateful that you suffered through this with us, but it is an interesting part of the history of ham radio that involves technology and culture in history. Something that's almost gone and rarely gets talked about now. Although, Tom, I did go in and did a search for QST to find out when the last time was that there was an article that significantly talked about drift. And it was a 2012 article about building your own little mini transmitter.
Right.
And so, there's still some discussion out there with homebrew stuff that I guess, and of course, you could get in the forums of people who are looking to continue to use the vintage radios and how to reduce the amount of drift with those. So it's been fun. You've been listening and watching here, Ham Radio Perspectives. We haven't given our episode credits for a long time, so let's take turn on this. Go ahead with the first one, Tom.
All right, direct sample covering our audio.
Yeah, and Mona Band. Oh, she's great with quality control.
Auto Tuner for our sponsorships.
U-Bolt.
I haven't seen any monetary sponsorship yet, but hey, we're working on it.
Yeah, well, I've got something in the pipeline that I haven't told you about yet. Right? I wrote to a manufacturer saying, would you give us a loaner that we can do a review on? I don't want to tell you yet what it is, but it is going to be very interesting if they respond at all. Of course, they've probably watched some of our videos and said, I don't have anything to do with those guys. The U-Bolt, the diversity director.
And Fanny Dipole, hospitality. Always has fresh donuts and coffee.
You bet. And Remote, who's running the board for us. So there you have it with Ham Radio Perspectives. We're a sad operation. If you like us, if you're sad in your operation too, and you want to join us in the fun, if Ham Radio can't be fun, Tom, we're in deep doo-doo. So down below, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Tell other hams about it, or non-hams that maybe see beers that want to become hams. I think we might appeal to see beers with some of this stuff, you know. And also send us ideas for any topics. We're on a roll. This is 3 videos, Tom, in 2 weeks.
Right.
And I think
send us a topic, no matter how ridiculous it sounds.
right.
We'll probably find a value in it.
Yeah, the more ridiculous, the more likely we'll do it. There's always underlying fun, but also seriousness with what we're doing, because what a great hobby. I love ham radio, Tom, and you've been a lifelong friend in the hobby, and I appreciate it. So everybody, thanks for tuning in. 73 from the 2 of us, Quinn, K8QS.
And Tom, WA9TDD.
Bye-bye.